Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Social Flight Live. I'm Jeff Simon. We have such a wonderful show for you this evening. The most inspirational, motivational, and truly wonderful person I can imagine on the planet. Colonel Nicole Malachowski is here with us again, and I'm just absolutely thrilled to get to her, to be able to talk to her about such an important subject as coping with pilot health issues, which is something I think more and more people in general aviation have to face. Before we get started, just a few updates about things happening here at SocialFlight, as always. First of all, we're seeing so many fall fly-ins, young eagles, and get-togethers that are happening. It really seems like things across the country are working out for some great flying weather. So be sure to check out socialflight.com or the free SocialFlight mobile apps on Apple and Android devices, and there are tens of thousands of aviation events and destinations, $100 hamburgers, cool places to fly. There's just so much going on there. So be sure to check that out. In addition, we have our Fly to Win challenge. We just gave away a Lightspeed Zulu 3 headset, and the winner was Robert McGuire, and just absolutely thrilled that he won this new headset, and we're giving away another one now. So all you need to do is get the SocialFlight mobile app, get out there and fly. If you check in at just any airport during the prize period, you're entered to win. And if you check in at a bunch of places and wind up on the top 30 of our leaderboard, then you have extra entries. So it's all good. And then the last thing is that within SocialFlight, we have launched our FAA learning system, which means that if you are interested in wings credits or FAA AMT credits or going for your A&P IA renewal and want to get that education in, it is all available for free and on demand in SocialFlight. Just go to socialflight.com, click on the FAA credits icon, and you'll be able to make all of that work. It's all free, and we've dedicated everything we do to supporting you and general aviation as a whole. And so with that, I'd like to also mention that tonight's broadcast is brought to you by Aspen Avionics, a very strong supporter of SocialFlight and a company that makes it so possible for us to have this. And I'm going to share an image with you that I'm very, very excited about. This is going to be the first time that we have shown this publicly. It is ahead of our YouTube build for what we're doing with our Mustang, but I'm going to give you a sneak peek right now. This is the panel of our Mustang, our T51 Titan Mustang that we just lit up as we're moving forward in this build with Aspen right at the center of it. And we're really, really excited about that. It was a big day, and you'll get to see that video released shortly, showing how we completed that step of our build. And we did it to stay right in line with what we have in the Bonanza. I'm a huge fan, as I mentioned, of doing this. You know, there's a lot of smaller displays that you can get for aircraft, and by having the form factor of the Aspen and being able to do top to bottom synthetic vision, their E5 unit that's so inexpensive and you can continue to just upgrade over time, I just recommend everybody check that out. So with that, I would like to introduce my first guest, my favorite guest tonight, Colonel Nicole Malachowski, the first Thunderbirds pilot of the United States Air Force. When Colonel Nicole Malachowski was in middle school, believe it or not, women were prohibited from becoming fighter pilots. But against these odds, she joins us today as a combat veteran. She's a pilot that has flown the amazing F15E Strike Eagle in multiple war zones. She rose to become a flight commander, an instructor pilot, and flight lead, and has more than 2,300 hours in 6 different Air Force aircraft. She served as a White House Fellow as well, and as I mentioned earlier, became the first female Thunderbirds pilot with that amazing air demonstration team. She retired due to medical reasons in 2017, and since that time, has transformed her life's work into helping others face similar life challenges, which is what we're going to talk about this evening. I'm going to bring Colonel Malachowski on the call right now, and it is my great honor to welcome you to the show. Nicole, how are you?
I'm doing great. Greetings from Colorado. Happy to be here.
Thank you so much for coming back on. It is such an honor to have you here, and I'm reminded every time I even look behind you at what is essentially your office and your set there, at what your accomplishments are. It really is amazing.
Well, thank you kindly, and it's definitely good to be back. It's always a joy, not just to chat with you, but also to hang out with all of your followers who I've managed to meet in person a few times and communicate with on social media myself. So hello, everybody.
I want to give a call out to one of those in particular here. I'm gonna bring a picture up here. For all of those who don't know that this is a very, very small world, you were in the San Diego airport, and Marguerite and Don Hickman came up and found you, and you guys even ended up calling me at that time.
Indeed. I was just coming home from a business trip. I was kind of tired, kind of hungry, and so I was grabbing maybe a sandwich and possibly an adult beverage. I wasn't flying that day, so I thought I could grab a beer. It was the Stone Brewing Company, and these two folks were sitting behind me, and they kept looking at me. And finally, he got up, I think, to get another beer, and Marguerite turned around and said, "Are you Nicole Malachowski? I listened to you on SocialFlight Live." Well, we just clicked. I think we spent the next hour just totally chatting with each other, and I think all three of us nearly missed our flights. So hi, everybody. Good to see you again.
So to everyone out there, just remember, it's a small world here in general aviation and in our SocialFlight community, and we're just thrilled when we get a chance to meet some of you and not just be behind the camera here. And I was absolutely thrilled that you all called me. It made my Father's Day when that happened. That's for sure.
Well, we couldn't believe that we were connected through, this podcast and through you. And so I was like, you know what? I have Jeff's phone number. He would get a kick out of this if we call him right now. And so we did. Why not? Seize the day.
Exactly. So Nicole, one of the things I want to do is just kind of set a background here about your life and some of the amazing accomplishments and what kind of made you who you were before you got to that point of having to face medical challenges, so that we can give people an idea of where you come from.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's hard to synopsize 47 years of living here, but I grew up in Central California. I was born in Santa Maria, eventually raised in Las Vegas, Nevada. I remember going to an air show when I was 5 years old, and I saw an F4 Phantom fly by, right, which was the workhorse of the Vietnam War. And I remember just the smell of the jet fuel and covering my ears because of the sound and how my whole body just rumbled. And just being super excited and shaking with excitement. Like when little kids like completely get excited, that was me. And at 5 years old, I remember thinking, I want to be a fighter pilot someday. Now, of course, I had no clue that it was technically against the law for women to become fighter pilots. But as a kid, you're not concerning yourself with Congress. But that's what kind of lit my fire. And I stayed very much, I like to say, maniacally focused on this goal since I was 5 of becoming a fighter pilot. And I'm glad it worked out because I didn't really have a backup plan. But, I joined things like the Civil Air Patrol and Junior ROTC. They afforded me scholarships to fly while I was in high school. So I was able to, solo before I got my driver's license. And it set me up well, of course, to head off to the Air Force Academy. Growing up in Las Vegas, Nevada, I mean, Nellis Air Force Base is right there, which of course, as you know, is home of the fighter pilot. So having those fighter jets fly overhead, seeing Thunderbirds fly as a kid, kept me focused, kept me on the right path, kept me from getting, I guess, distracted a little bit, but found my way, to the United States Air Force Academy, graduated in 1996, lucky enough to get a pilot slot. Headed off to Columbus Air Force Base, spent a year there. I was lucky enough to finish 4th in my class, which allowed me to pick an F15E Strike Eagle. So I headed to F15E training at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in North Carolina. And I guess we'll go faster and funnier. Over that career, I flew in 3 operational F15E squadrons. I had the privilege of commanding the 333rd Fighter Squadron at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base. Worked in the White House twice. I also served as an ALO with the Army 2nd Infantry Division in Korea, a couple other little fun assignments in there. And then my very last assignment, I was working at the White House. And everything was going really, really well. I was a full bird colonel. Was heading in the right direction. I was competitive maybe for the next promotion. And I got really sick, kind of out of nowhere, very unexpectedly and very unwelcome. And unfortunately, that's when my career came to an end. And in 2017, as a full bird colonel, overnight, my life changed. And I found myself medically retired. And I found myself going, what in the world am I going to do now? You know, who am I if I'm not wearing my nation's uniform? Who am I if I'm not flying as an aviator? What's my contribution to society anymore? And that's how I kind of went through this transition, which I think we're going to talk about tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I mean, obviously, you're probably the most positive human being I've ever met and know as a friend. I can't imagine, though, getting that news and also having to deal with the effects of the illness um, was not something that kind of knocked, put a little bump in the road. And in that, what was it like going from that type A, very uh, incredibly positive to being faced with something that's an internal vulnerability, like what your body's doing?
Oh, I mean, it remains to this day one of this, I would say the second most difficult thing I've ever done in my life, because my pregnancy with my twins, which was a whole nother medical odyssey, was very emotional, and there was 3 lives involved. And so that will always probably remain the most difficult thing. But this medical retirement in 2017, the fact of the matter is it completely broke me. I mean, I went from somebody who was, at the time I got sick, actually, I was the commander of this fighter squadron right here, and I was physically fit, and I was mentally fit, and I was spiritually fit. And I came down with this mysterious kind of complex chronic illness that no doctors could figure out. And for the next 4 years after I left that assignment, I struggled, you know, with the medical system, in particular with the military medical system, which has its own challenges. You know, to figure out what was wrong with me, I fought to hold on to my career, which was going really well. And I did, in fact, find myself a full bird colonel in the White House. But for 4 years, I mean, I suffered, you know, until August of 2017, when I woke up in my bed in Northern Virginia, thinking I was going to put my uniform on that day and go to work at the White House. And instead, I woke up locked in. I could not walk, talk, move, speak, anything. And I had to wait there until somebody found me. And when you go from someone who is completely independent, you know, kind of type A fighter pilot, to someone who overnight is completely dependent on other people for all activities of your daily living, that's scary. It's terrifying. It is hard for my ego. And it was just very confusing at the time, you know, what's going to happen. And for the people watching, you should know these moments of kind of being locked in, or what I call temporary paralysis, they would come and go. So they would last a few seconds or a few minutes. It was almost like someone had a clicker. They could turn me on and turn me off, and, you know, I would never know. It was a very scary time for our family. And, you know, at that moment, it became a matter of just survival, right? You forget about going to work. You know, you forget about putting on your uniform, or that you're a fighter pilot, or you're supposed to fly planes or be an officer. Like, it became instantaneously a moment of survival. And as we worked through an accurate diagnosis and treatment, you know, I remained hopeful that I would be able to get back into the aircraft. And I'll never forget the moment. I was actually in a wheelchair because I couldn't walk. My husband was with me. We were up at Massachusetts General Hospital, where I was finally accurately diagnosed. It took 4 years and 24 plus doctors across 8 specialties to finally diagnose me correctly. And I remember looking at the doctor and kind of mouthing whatever words I could say, and my husband was supporting me. I said, "How long until I can get back into the jet?" That was the first question. As soon as she diagnosed me, I said, "How long until I can get back into the jet?" I mean, that's what any pilot would say, right?
Yeah.
And Dr. Nevena Zubčević, who saved my life, she looked down at me and she said, "I don't think you're ever going to fly again. You were undiagnosed for too long, and too much damage has been done to your brainstem." And wow, I'm kind of reliving it right now. I mean, everything that I had wanted since I was 5 years old, everything I had been since I was 5 years old, all of that effort, that entire dream, all that I had done in that military career, you know, was gone. And I'm not going to sit here and say that I was instantaneously hopeful and optimistic like you see today. I was absolutely crushed and absolutely devastated. So.
Wow. I mean, I'm so sorry. That must have been, really crushing. I want to catch on to one thing, touch on something that you said, and and that was how when that critical moment hit you of being essentially paralyzed,
Mm,
that nothing else mattered at that point, though. That
indeed.
that that the focus changes.
100%. I mean, it was literally life or death, like literally. And I think when those of us face that kind of a moment, you pretty instinctually and instantaneously know.
Yeah, one of the things though that's remarkable about it is in aviation, the way that things are set up both in the military and also through the FAA and medical system, et cetera. I mean, obviously we fly as a privilege and we fly as much as we're allowed to based on our medical condition, period. And that wool, that rug can get pulled out at any moment.
Indeed.
It it seems that there is no, I've seen in so many people that it's hard for there to be a gradual path of trying to take care of things and take care of ourselves
Hmm.
when problems start, because we just don't want to threaten
Right.
our flying and our career, and yet sometimes we'll play with fire all the way up until that point, and then all of a sudden it's gone completely, and all you think about is forget about flying. I just want to be able to move.
Right. Well, I think it's human nature, right? First of all, I think pilots are all cut from the same cloth, if you will, personality and characteristic wise. I mean, regardless of what type of pilot you are, commercial, military, just a private pilot having fun, like that's all we want to do. That's our passion. We put effort into it. We enjoy it. It's fun. It adds to the beauty of our life. That's why we do it. And just the idea of going to the doctor to say, hey, I think something's a little different or something might be wrong, I'm sensing something that's a little bit off. We think, I don't want to risk, right? Giving up, my passion, this idea of being grounded. Like no pilot wants to be grounded. And unfortunately, to your point, what can happen over time when we ignore the smaller things is eventually they can grow into very big things that become much more difficult to fix, or maybe much more time consuming or even financially consuming to fix, or ultimately, in some cases, become completely unfixable. And so if we look back about and think about how much we really love aviation and we love being in that cockpit, if there's somebody out there watching right now that's kind of got a little something that's a little different, you're just noticing I'm feeling a different way, I'm not able to focus, I've got a little extra pain, I say get in there and get to the doctor now and nip this absolutely in the bud. You know, life exists outside of the cockpit. Joy and happiness, I can tell you, can be found, even when you're an old washed up fighter pilot that's DNIF for life now, right? I'm grounded for life, but there's still a lot of good to be found. So take the chance, go in and see your doctor, talk about it, try to nip these things in the bud before they become irreversible.
That makes a lot of sense, and yet, of course, it's always so hard to follow, to do. But I mean, you're right. I mean, on one hand, by kind of essentially being open about medical issues early, you have the best chance of fixing them and staying in the cockpit. Uh, on the other hand, if everything's not going to allow you to stay in the cockpit, it still makes more sense, I think, for more people to remain healthier rather than risk that health for some duration of time in the cockpit before ultimately it's ended in some obvious fashion.
Absolutely. And, in my case, I just told you mine was very unexpected, very overnight, very, unwelcome, and I didn't have any control over it. And so when I listen to pilots who are saying, I'm not feeling quite well, or, I don't want to go actually into the doctor, I personally get just a little bit, like frustrated, because even if it's bad news, and I've received the worst of the news, right? Even if it's bad news for you, at least you'll be given that time, right? To put your health first, that amount of time to think about how to reinvent yourself, that amount of time to think about how you're going to stay connected and you're going to still have an impact on the aviation community, so that it's not this abrupt, fall off the cliff like happened to me. I look at people and go, right now you have time to kind of ease into this if
Mhm.
indeed it is bad news. But that's because I have the perspective that I have, right? I mean, hindsight's always 20/20 for all of us.
Well, maybe that perspective, I'd like to talk about that for a minute, because I think that the perspective on what you can be, and that the end of your time as PIC, at least in the cockpit, or something else, isn't the end of everything. If we can telegraph ahead and see what life could be, then maybe that you manage things a lot more differently now than you do. So tell me about your transition
Yeah.
from, this top of the game,
Mhm.
Air Force commander, to someone now who is world renowned and sought after for speaking, and have this, unbelievable a career position that in many ways is evolutionary from where you were.
Yeah, I feel like I have to give you guys a little bit of context in order, to answer that. I want to tell you that the day that my military retirement came, December 29th, 2017, I had been bedridden and housebound for over a year and a half, and was going through the military medical evaluation board, or military medical retirement process, which, by the way, is just a difficult thing to go through. But I remember the day that it came. I had no ceremony. I never had an Air Force retirement ceremony. Half of my stuff was mailed to me, like in an envelope in the mail, my retirement paperwork and stuff, like, thank you for your service. And the day of my retirement also, not one person from the Air Force called, not one. Nobody from my chain of command, right? You left us a year and a half ago to go to doctor's appointments and be a patient, and, out of sight, out of mind. And I think that added to my hurt, right, and to my pain. I definitely felt, and I've said this publicly, and I mean it, and I'll say it again, I felt deeply abandoned and betrayed by the Air Force that I had given so much to. And at that same time, right, I'm enduring a severe infection, and your viewers need to know I had a systemic bodily infection from a tick bite. I had 5 different tick-borne illnesses. They had indeed gotten into my central nervous system and had indeed impacted my brainstem. So this was, a big deal. I was going to vestibular rehab. I was learning to walk and talk and read and write and all those things again. And that day that it came, 29 December 2017, I cried. It was low. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I was like, oh, no big deal, I'm just going to move on. We're human beings, and I believe when you endure medical stuff like this, you have to give yourself an ability to grieve. You have to cry. You have to grieve. You have to feel sorry for yourself for a bit. It's okay to be sad, right? It's okay to realize this isn't what I expected and I'm upset. And I afforded myself and my husband and my family that space to do that. And I think that's important, okay? But as I laid there that day, I remember thinking, who am I if I'm not wearing my nation's uniform? Who am I if I'm not an officer in the Air Force? Who am I if I'm not in a cockpit? Like, who's ever gonna hire me, right? What could I possibly do? Because what your viewers don't know is I live with complex chronic illness, right? I have a difficulty reading and writing. I have a lot of fatigue and pain. I have a balance deficit, which is why they won't let me pass an FAA medical, along with the reading and writing problem. And so at that moment, it just all came down. And as I sat there, very distinctly, these words came to my head, and I want to share them with your viewers. The words that came to my head were yield to overcome. I don't know why those 3 words came to my head. You can call it God, the universe, whatever you think. Yield to overcome. And with those words, that was kind of that click moment where I realized it's okay to reminisce about the past, but don't ruminate on the past. And this moment, it's not what you can't do. You're asking yourself the wrong questions, Nicole. Yield to overcome means acceptance. Accepting what happened to you. I didn't ask to get bit by some random tick. I didn't ask to be undiagnosed as long as I did. I didn't ask to be as sick as I was. It just was. So the real question, Nicole, is what is it that you can do now to move forward? For our aviation, metaphors here or analogies, I always get those words mixed up, but the runway behind you is always unusable unless you're a helicopter pilot. The runway in front of you is what you got, and yield to overcome snapped me out of it and got me to be, a little bit more forward looking.
Wow, that's a fascinating approach to it. And it's true. I mean, you mentioned, of course, that you have to allow yourself to mourn it. Indeed. And then allow yourself to be motivated to move beyond it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, so you kind of alluded into like, how did you end up becoming a speaker? Look, I am an accidental speaker if there ever was one. I mean, I'm a speaker and leadership consultant now. And very selfishly, one of the reasons I do it is I get to take my aviation stories and my lessons learned and share them with people. I couldn't just let aviation go. It's a part of who I am. I'm a fighter pilot, darn it, and I got stories to tell. And as I was working through speech therapy and working on my memory, I would start talking about these turning points in my career and these turning points in my personal life. And a couple people were like, those are interesting stories, like there's professional speakers. And I laughed. I laughed at the idea that there was a speaking industry. And I laughed at the idea that anybody would pay somebody, to listen to their story. Obviously, I've been doing this for 4 years now, and I've learned my lesson the positive way. But as I was sitting there trying to think, what am I going to do with myself? I can't work a full-time job. I can't, probably be dependable or reliable to other people or other teams. I probably need to start my own business. The entrepreneurial spirit kind of kicked in. And then I came across, as I was looking about, what am I going to do and doing a little research, I came across a Japanese philosophy, which I think I've talked to you about before.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, this Japanese philosophy is called ikigai or ikigai. It is a very formal tradition in Japan, and I want to pay it its due respect. If you want to learn more about it, it's Ikigai, but I'm going to give you the very westernized simple version really quick. When you're trying to reinvent yourself, right, or move forward, Ikigai says you need to find something that combines 4 things. Something you're good at, something you love, something the world needs, and something you can get paid for. And I loved people. I love connecting with people. I love talking with people. So that's cool. And I figured out they do pay people to speak and do leadership consulting. And the world kind of does need it, right? There's conferences and leadership development, so I could fit into that niche. But the thing that I was stuck on, the hardest part of those 4 circles, was trying to figure out something I'm good at. Because I kept coming back to, I'm just a pilot. I'm just a fighter pilot. That's all I've known since I was 5 years old. I can't be a pilot anymore. I don't know what I'm good at. And that's where I got stuck for like weeks. And then it hit me. The best way to figure out what you're good at is to ask other people. The people who are your friends, your family, in your network. And they started pointing out things to me that I had never even considered about my skill sets as a speaker or a storyteller, or with leadership ideas and lessons learned. And all of a sudden, those 4 rings came together into my ikigai, which was my reinvention into professional speaking and leadership consulting.
That's so wonderful and fascinating to me, and it pulls together. I mean, I remember seeing a presentation that you gave that's out on the web or on your website or somewhere, talking. It may have been to a conference that involved women in business and leadership. You were talking about managing both home, family, all the aspects that someone has to manage, and thinking back on how you did that.
Mm-hmm.
In the Air Force in that leadership role.
Oh, and, yeah.
Oh, I'll tell you, for anyone out there, go do a search. You're going to find this. You get a taste of what it's like to go and see Nicole speak aside from tonight. And that, to me, that you don't just invent that. You don't just create something like that. These were ideas that you were using before this illness ever happened.
Sure.
That were things that were inside you. And so I love the idea of putting this philosophy to work and having others around you tell you what you're good at and point out some of those things. Because you certainly didn't wind up presenting with a bunch of people in the audience going, oh my God, she's got nothing to say.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I always tell people when they're going after kind of a big dream or a gnarly dream or some sort of, complex goal, whatever it might be, personal, professional, when they get that kind of, I'm not sure I can do it, what if I fail, it's too hard, maybe the imposter syndrome that some of us, get sometimes. I remind them, who are the people that are cheering you on? There's got to be at least one person in your life. I mean, we all have that one person. Hopefully we have maybe just a couple, but just one good one is all it takes. And I tell them, believe those who believe in you. Believe those who believe in you. And I tell that to myself a lot. Because even today, as a professional speaker, I mean, I got asked, early on to speak in a stadium to 15,000 people. Now I'm thinking to myself, you've got to be kidding me. And at that point, I'd spoken to several hundred. I'd spoken to up to actually about 5,000, in a normal conference room. And even me, after all that experience and all these years as a fighter pilot, in that moment, I thought to myself, how am I supposed to go into a stadium with 15,000 people and talk to them? I'm not sure I can do that. And then my husband's like, what are you talking about? It's just 15,000 individuals. You speak to an individual, pick a couple faces in the audience. And that's where I kind of remind myself, believe those who believe in you. If there's people that believe I can do it, I can do it. And I stepped out there, and within the first, 10 seconds, I knew it was going to be okay.
Wow. That's and of course for all of us who are used to watching you, for us, same thing. It's like, yeah, of course you could. Where do I buy a ticket?
Well, that's kind of you to say. Sometimes you look strong and confident on the outside, but on the inside, I still had butterflies in my stomach, and I still had a rapid heartbeat. And that's good for us to feel that way still sometimes, every now and again, right? Because that's how you know that you're about to grow. Like you're about to do something you didn't know you can do. You're about to do something you haven't done before. And that's pretty exciting. And, it's interesting that what you haven't done before, sometimes people go, Nicole, you broke barriers and you were a trailblazer as the first woman Thunderbird pilot. And, I don't get to decide what's barrier breaking or trailblazing. I let other people think about that. And they go, that's really neat that you did something that no one else has done before. And I always tell people the coolest thing about being a trailblazer is that you're doing something that you've never done before. I'm not as excited that I did something that nobody else had ever done before. I'm more proud that I did something that I had never done before. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. Absolutely. Absolutely. So kind of rewinding on the process a little bit, because a lot of people, so we've certainly seen and heard some of what you've been through and how you've managed to navigate through it. It seems that one of the possibilities for people is how you can think through some of this in advance. Is there anything you can do to try to kind of disinherit this assumption that you are only a pilot, that it's the core of what you are? Do you think is that kind of, am I just like being goofy about it, or is it actually possible, do you think, that people can put some thought into it to inoculate themselves a little bit into this idea that that they have to push back, they have to be super people, and there's nothing else if this falls apart?
Well, so that was my mindset, right? So it's really easy for me to sit here, with the benefit of hindsight and try to answer, what is a very complex and I think thoughtful, question. How do we make ourselves strong and resilient so that if we are faced with medical challenges and if we are faced with being grounded for the rest of our lives, like me, we can deal with that? And I think one of the first things I tell people, because I do get contacted by a lot of pilots who are going through medical issues, to try to give them the support that they need, as you go through that kind of a difficult transition. I remind them that you are so much more, right, than what you are outside of the cockpit. And if it ends tomorrow and you can never fly again, nobody, nothing can take away what you did. Every flight you took, every qualification and certification you achieved, right? Every time you slip the surly bonds of Earth exists. It's not just a memory, it's a fact. You're always a pilot. I tell people I'm a fighter pilot. Sure, I'm not flying, but dang it, I'm a fighter pilot. Pilots and fighter, it's an attitude, right? It's a mentality that allows us to be successful in a lot of different areas. So remind yourself that no matter what, nobody can take away what you did. You're once a pilot, always a pilot. And
I think that's really, really, really important, because I've had so many people say to me that are facing those things, like, what am I now? Like even people who have lost their licenses or have had other things that have been challenges. There's that question of, am I still a pilot? And I always want to embrace them and say, like, yes, you don't have to be able at the moment to pilot an aircraft. You may never be again, but you're a pilot. If that's how you used to introduce yourself, that's how you're still introducing yourself. Whatever it is, how you think about yourself, you're still a pilot.
Pilot is an attitude, right? Pilot's a set of personality traits and characteristics, and we all know it,
And accomplishment.
For better or for worse, and it doesn't matter if you're flying gliders or you're flying the F-22 or anything in between, we all are cut from the same, the same type of cloth. And people ask me when I meet them and they hear about my story, they kind of go, wow, Nicole, you went from fighter pilot, Thunderbird pilot, White House to, grounded for the rest of your life. I'm so sorry. And it's very kind and gracious that they say that. But in looking back, I don't want people to be sorry for me. I used to believe that my life history, if my tombstone was written, right, my legacy, my obituary, it was going to say, Nicole was a fighter pilot, right, and Nicole was an officer in the United States Air Force, and that somehow was my legacy. And I look back now and I chuckle at how narrow of a view I had of myself and how limited that really was. And what I know now is that all of the characteristics, skills, and traits that I honed as a fighter pilot, discipline, right, determination, the ability to multitask, the ability to focus, all of those things, the same ones all of you out there have honed, those were the very characteristics I needed to survive my illness, right, and become as healthy as I can be, right, to become independent again, which I am, and to reinvent myself. And where I am now, as a grounded pilot, I have a bigger impact more quickly, more positively on more people than if I had ever just stayed a pilot, or if I had ever just stayed a pilot in the Air Force. So being a pilot gave me the character, skills, and traits to become an even bigger and I think better version of myself. And so those same traits exist in all of you. And those of you that are watching that are facing medical issues or fearing that medical unknown, there is definitely hope and there is an ability to reinvent, and you can still take those pilot traits and turn them into something great.
That's such a wonderful way of looking at it. And I think it's a very interesting parallel to what so many like ultra successful people have always said about how their success is built upon their failures, that every pivot that's happened in their life that created genius was based on failure, that invention's based on failure. Like, even though medical illness is not, quote, failure,
Correct.
it seems that yes, someone could be a commercial pilot, they could be any number of things along the way, but it's the same challenge point or decisive point that happens in your life that you look back on later, because I've never known anyone who's failed after having a bit transition. They've always grown and blossomed and evolved in whatever it is. And you look back and say, wow, so you could have just continued that. What you're mourning is that you could have continued the same thing, but you keep that legacy. You still have all those accomplishments. But now you got a new chapter that you wouldn't have had.
That you can shape in any way you want. That's the beauty of it. I think, when we start to see ourselves as just a pilot, right, we're missing out on all of these other doors and windows and opportunities, that are out there. If you had asked me 5 years ago that I would be a professional speaker and consultant, I would have laughed in your face, right? But this is what I do now, and I absolutely love it. And I think it just stands as a testament to, like, I really believe that we all have the power to reinvent ourselves at any given time. And we talk a lot nowadays about this concept of resilience. I know it's in the American lexicon now, which is great. It's important for us to talk about resilience. But remember, resilience is, when you're standing and you fall down, you have a mistake of failure, you fail a check ride, which I did. How do you get back into the cockpit, the next day to try again? You got to be tough. You got to be resilient. After that failure, how do you get back in the cockpit? Well, sometimes when medical things come around, right, which are not in our control, like a check ride is a little bit more in our control, right? I mean, sickness and illness is not in our, and injury is not in our control, right? It is unexpected. And it's not a matter of being resilient. People say you're so resilient, and I know they're trying to be nice, but I'm more than that. I like to use the term resurgent, right? Because an illness like this fundamentally changes who you are, fundamentally changes everything, about you and everything about you moving forward. It's a fact. I mean, again, my story is an example. There is no bouncing back to my old self. She's gone. She does not exist. All right. This is about resurgence. This is about coming out of these things different. Like I am much more compassionate towards other people than I ever was before. And I considered myself a pretty nice person, but I'm more compassionate. I have more clarity on the things that are important to me. I've learned how to set boundaries and say no to things, right? So that I can live by my priorities. I'm a lot more determined on what my purpose is. And I'm a heck of a lot stronger than I ever gave myself credit for. And so resilience is cool, but resurgence is even cooler.
I love that. Absolutely love that. And you touched on something else, which I think I also want to latch on to and talk a little bit more, and that has to do with the compassion. Because if there's one trait I have seen, I've seen it in my own struggles, I've seen it in many other people's struggles that I know, is that there seems to be something wonderful that happens as people do that go through that resurgence, go through that evolution following crisis. They often become far more focused on others and on what they can do to kind of give back. And what's interesting is not only do they switch to become more compassionate or give back, but they seem to wind up happier. It's almost this forced evolution and pivot point in their lives.
I think it goes back to, right, until you experience something that's this life-changing, right? And there are people watching right now who I know who have gone through similar or even more difficult, medical challenges and life-changing type events. Like, it's so easy to just go through life when you're healthy, right? Expecting that every day is going to be fine and you're going to get in the jet and you're going to fly and it's going to be good. And you think very individualistically, not in a bad way, right? But that's your life. This is my identity. I'm going to put on my uniform. I'm going to get in my jet, and then all of a sudden, poof, your entire world absolutely explodes, and you're exposed to, like you said, like that compassion. You're exposed to clarity of purpose, and your world just becomes a heck of a lot, I think, bigger. And you realize that your impact is not just on that one cockpit and that one plane or that one day. It can be bigger, right? It's that kind of ripple effect. Well, now I can take what I've learned through this illness and I can actually help other people, right? Reinvent themselves. I can actually help other people, soften that difficult landing that they're about to have when their life changes. And I think it speaks to just human nature in our hearts. We want connection. And an illness and reinvention like this allows you greater connection. And I love all my fighter pilot friends and all my Air Force friends, but you know what? My chronic illness tribe that I have now, right? This new group of people who've all been bitten by a tick. I've got friends around the world, right? That we talk to, lawyers, I've got doctors, I've got pilots, I've got bankers. All of us had our world just flipped upside down. And I have this whole, you're exposed to just a whole new, bigger world, and it's a pretty cool thing. And for context too, and I know you know this, Jeff, but I speak for fun on the side to help pay the bills and go on vacations. But my primary amount of time in my day that's free, I'm a patient advocate. I sit on several government boards, several academic panels, and several nonprofits because, to your point, I have something to give now because of this illness that I didn't have to give before. Yeah.
I think that's a fascinating thing, and it's maybe a little bit of a silver lining to some of the challenges that so many people face. Even if people aren't in aviation, they always talk about when they've gone through things like this that they used to be all focused on money, and now they're focused more on people. I mean, everything seems to universally switch to refocusing on something that gives them more happiness and more connection.
Yep, more connection, more happiness. It's a feeling of significance, right? I think as a fighter pilot, I had an impact, but I think doing what I do now as someone who's a patient advocate, who's had to go through being permanently grounded, like I now think I'm more significant in what I do to other people, with other people. Like I can be a positive, significant impact on people. Does that make sense? There's a
Makes a lot of
difference. Yeah.
sense. No, it makes a lot of sense. Now, your work, particularly in tick-borne illnesses, is, I think, an extraordinarily important one. Tell me a little bit about that world, because that's an illness
It's the
that,
Wild West.
yeah, and with so much under or non-diagnosis or improper diagnosis, like this is something that I think as many people who are on the line need to hear.
I got to tell you, I mean, tick-borne illness is something that can be absolutely devastating and life-changing. I'm proof of that. And it is unnecessarily controversial. There is a lack of education, a lack of awareness. I am here to tell you, one tick bite can absolutely change your life. The best way to avoid tick-borne illnesses or becoming chronically ill from a tick-borne illness is to avoid getting the tick bite. So I'm big in talking to people about tick bite prevention. Things like treating your gear, like your shoes, your golf bag, your camping equipment, whatever, with permethrin, wearing an insect repellent on exposed skin, knowing how to do a proper tick check, and especially proper tick removal. There's only one way, and it's with fine point tweezers, my friend. None of those other old wives' tales, okay? And then what symptoms to look for, and that's where things get complicated, because the symptoms of Lyme disease and other tick-borne illnesses tend to be very vague, right? Fever, malaise, joint pain, muscle pain. It can easily and understandably be confused, with many other illnesses out there. So it's one of those things where I tell people, like, prevent the bite first. And if you find yourself with complex chronic symptoms that don't make sense to doctors or anybody else, and you've ruled out the big other things, it's probably reasonable to look into tick-borne illnesses. And Jeff, you're going to get me on my soapbox because I could keep going, but I'll let you guide my time on tick-borne illness.
Well, I mean, I think it's very important. So, I mean, is it something that can be, in your case, you said it was diagnosed much later. Is it something that if people are long past having a mark from a tick or rash or something like that, can still be diagnosed?
Yeah, absolutely. So I went 4 years misdiagnosed. I received 3 different misdiagnoses. Those would include fibromyalgia, undifferentiated connective tissue disorder, as well as probable multiple sclerosis. So those were the misdiagnoses that I received. During that time, right, these bacteria, viruses, and parasites that ticks can give you were just building up, right, the bacterial load in my body, and they eventually got into my brain. And it took 4 years for them to eat away at me until I woke up, basically locked in. The fact that tick-borne illnesses were never considered is unacceptable, right? It is something that people should think about once other things, have been ruled out, and that you aren't getting better with treatment for some of these other things. Look, 500,000 Americans a year, according to the CDC, get Lyme disease. Those are the ones who are diagnosed and treated in the acute phase. So we're not even counting all the other people out there. Of those 500,000, 20%, according to the CDC, will remain chronically ill for 6 months or more. I'm obviously in that 20%. Other studies, including ones out of Johns Hopkins University, say upwards of 50%. But let's go with the CDC numbers. That's 100,000 Americans a year who are becoming chronically disabled because of a tick bite. The tests that we have are not accurate in the acute phase of disease when it is most treatable. What happens is, if you get a tick bite, most people who get Lyme disease don't recall seeing a tick. Those little boogers are small, and if they're in your hair or on your back, or you're not doing a daily tick check, you're going to miss them. When they bite you, they actually put out a little chemical that purposely numbs your skin so that you won't feel them. Did you know that? So you have to use your eyes and your hands to go out and look for this. Of the people who get Lyme, 50% don't get any kind of rash. Further, the 50% that are lucky and do get a rash, that rash is not always in the shape of the bullseye that we talk about. Lyme disease rashes can come in many different shapes and forms and look very different on different tones of skin. So there's a lot of myths, if you will, out there that we need to overcome. You might not see the tick. You might not see a rash. The test doesn't become accurate until your body has built up enough antibodies to be positive, which takes 2 to 4 weeks. So what we see a lot is someone says, Doc, I got bit by a tick 3 days ago. Oh, I feel like I've got a sore neck. I've got a fever. The doctor says, oh, great, I'll give you a Lyme test. Lyme test comes back negative. Well, of course it's going to come back negative. Your body hasn't had time to create the antibodies for a positive test. And so what happens is they go misdiagnosed or undiagnosed, and then they end up 4 years later in a very late stage of disease that becomes much more difficult, much more than 3 weeks of oral antibiotics to treat, okay? And in many cases, a lot of damage has already been done, that can't be undone. So I'm getting on my tick soapbox, uh-oh.
Well, I think it's really important. I mean, it's very, very important. And with so many of our audience that do backcountry flying and things like that, I think it's very applicable to that.
100%. And we need to remember, ticks carry more than Lyme, all right? Ticks carry a plethora of different bacteria, viruses, and parasites. Every state has their own issue. People say, well, I wasn't in the Northeast, so I can't possibly have Lyme disease. Well, there's lots of different types of bugs that ticks can give you in nearly every state, okay? There's Lyme disease definitely up in the Northwest, so think Michigan, Wisconsin. We have a lot of Lyme disease in California. Does anybody know that? Yeah, I don't know why the CDC doesn't talk about it. The data is there. But Lyme is a bacteria called Borrelia burgdorferi. Borrelia is a little spirochete, little corkscrew-shaped little booger that likes to swim out of your blood and get into your, other connective tissues and your muscles and stuff and cause a lot of problems. And the fact of the matter is there are many different types of Borrelia. So one of the diseases I also had was something called Borrelia hermsii, which is a form of the Borrelia bacteria that comes from a soft-body tick that's only found in California, like California, Nevada, some of the western states. So when doctors test you for Lyme and you say I was bit by a tick and the Lyme test is negative, it is reasonable to ask about all of the other bacteria, viruses, and parasites. I mean, my gosh, we take our dogs once a year in for their wellness check and they get a tick-borne illness panel. We don't have anything like that for humans, which is why I do my advocacy work, so we can raise money to increase research, to create better tests. We need better therapeutics to cure people at all stages of disease. And we need to raise, obviously, medical provider education and awareness. I'll stop there.
I think it's very, very, very important. I think, switching a little bit, the other thing, which of course is top of mind right now and has a lot of people wondering, do I say anything to my doctor or don't I, has to do with some of the ramifications of COVID. Some of the things that people are finding, obviously, I would imagine that you've gotten some calls and
a lot.
Yeah, about what, I've certainly been approached by people that say, the last thing I want to do is tell my doctor I have symptoms of long COVID, or sometimes I feel foggy.
Well, wow, right? Wow. I'm so glad you brought this up. My heart literally breaks and aches for people who are getting long COVID. And I know COVID is very controversial. People have a lot of different varying beliefs about it. When you look at the scientific data, there are a percentage of people who get COVID who end up remaining significantly symptomatic. At this point, there are people who were in the first wave of COVID in the spring of 2020 that have been bedridden for 3 years. The latest estimate I heard in the United States alone was 4 million people who are out of work and unable to leave the house because of long COVID. Now people say, I don't believe in long COVID, that sounds silly, they just are lazy or it's all psychological. All I can say is I live with post-infectious syndrome. We have known scientifically for a long time that viral bacterial infections can lead to what we call long-term sequela or sequelae, right? Long-term syndrome. Post-infectious syndromes are not unheard of. You can have them in Lyme. You can have them in Epstein-Barr. There are people who get it following the flu. The percentage is much higher with COVID. And one of the things that's so hard when you have a post-infectious syndrome is these kind of mysterious symptoms that don't make sense. They don't fit into any bucket. Doctors don't know what to do with someone who has chronic Lyme. Doctors don't know what to do with someone who has long COVID. But here's the point, right? Science is going to bridge the gap on long COVID. I have a lot of hope in the scientists, and I have a lot of hope in the researchers. I follow this very closely. There's some really smart people working on it. If you are dealing with long COVID, which generally involves a heck of a lot of fatigue and a heck of a lot of brain fog, ask yourself, should I be piloting an aircraft, right? None of us should be at the controls of an aircraft, whether we're the sole passenger or we've got 200 people behind us, if we have brain fog. It is absolutely not worth it. Too many people care about you, too many people love you, and there's too much hope for treatments. There's too much hope on board, I think, for a cure in a reasonable amount of time. So don't do something you can't walk back from. And do what you can to not get COVID. All controversy aside, the science says the more times you get COVID, the higher your chances are of getting long COVID. So just like I say to prevent the bite, prevent infection with COVID. Thank you for that. Sorry. Oh my gosh, I didn't know that this podcast was going to go this direction. People are going to be like, my gosh, Nicole, people, remember, I am not a doctor. I want to make sure, like, this is all just based on my experience. I am not a doctor. This is not medical advice. But I do tell people, even though I don't have a science degree or a medical degree, I do have a PhD, and it stands for patient has disease. So I speak these things from experience because I care about you.
I think it is incredibly caring, and it makes so much sense. It really does. So don't think twice about being on these subjects. And by the way, I didn't even know there was anything controversial about Lyme disease. So when he said this is controversial, you've got me. Okay.
Let me tell you what's controversial, not to patients or caregivers, but to frontline medical providers, is that there is a belief that there isn't or can't be chronic Lyme disease. The belief is that 3 weeks of oral antibiotics called doxycycline cures everybody at most stages of disease. We patients and caregivers, we know that that's not true. We know that because we know each other and all of this, and we have clinicians and researchers who also agree with us based on what they're seeing clinically. The fact of the matter is that this really hasn't been studied in any way, shape, or form to the depth that it should. And that requires both money and it being prioritized by the government. So until we can get the government to say this is a problem and that we need more research, and we get the funding to come with it, right, then that's when we're gonna see, I think, the tipping point, and that's when we're gonna see things change. So in the meantime, you know, us advocates do our best to do the drum roll, to share our stories, to collaborate together, to gain that momentum or to gain the weight for that tipping point. What we have discovered, thanks to Dr. John Alcott out of, and many others, by the way, Dr. Monica Embers, is that there is, in fact, right, it exists. They call it post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome. It's been defined in the science. That's where they came up with the numbers that 20% stay sick. But the point is no one seems to be like doing anything about it. So it's very real. We know it's real. The question, the controversy is it a persistent infection? Is it an autoimmune response? Or is it permanent damage, right, that can't be undone? Is it one of the above, some of the above, maybe none of the above? So there's a portion of people that believe it is a low-grade persistent infection that should be treated. The IDSA and the CDC will say no, right, because of real important things, like we don't want people getting C. diff, you know, from being on antibiotics too long. You don't want to destroy your gut microbiome. We don't want antibiotic resistance, you know, which to me says, well, instead of denying it or not researching it, how about we come up with therapeutics that cure people at all stages of disease? Things that seem simple in government are actually quite hard. I worked in the government for more than 21 years, and I know lots of people watching have, so they probably understand what I'm trying to say. So it's a marathon and not a sprint, but we are making progress on breaking apart that controversy and getting to a place where, again, science will indeed bridge the gap.
Well, I think that's absolutely wonderful, and I just appreciate your message overall. The bottom line, I think, of course, is that there's life beyond having your medical threatened. There's life beyond your things like that, and it's just so wonderful to hear that from you.
And you know, as a reminder, right? If you find yourself medically grounded, if you find yourself grounded for life like me, and you're thinking to yourself, what am I going to do? I'm not a pilot anymore. It doesn't mean you can't be a part of aviation. I'm still a part of aviation. I share pilot stories all the time, and I get paid for it. I mean, you can teach ground school, you can teach simulators, right? You can work in other aspects of aviation, maybe become an air traffic controller and tell pilots where to go. I mean, maybe become an aircraft mechanic. You can still be involved. And one of the ways I'm still involved is, through mentoring young people, right? Helping young people become pilots, answering their questions, helping guide them in the right direction for training and for profession. So there's so many ways to still stay connected to your passion and to still make a difference, even if you're not the one in the cockpit.
I think that's just a wonderful, wonderful message. Well, Nicole, thank you so much, as always, for taking time out of your evening to spend it with us here on Social Flight Live. I am truly grateful for you taking the time to do that, and of course, for your friendship.
Well, right back at you. I appreciate your friendship too. I appreciate the audience. Thank you for letting me talk about Lyme and tick-borne illnesses. And to everybody out there watching, health is wealth. I'll tell you that. So take care of yourselves. I wish you all the best, and thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Good night.
Good night.
And to all of you, thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to join us here for another edition of Social Flight Live. Next week on Tuesday, September 20th, we will be joined by Lightspeed Aviation founder Alan Schrader, who will be talking about their newly announced headset, the Delta Zulu. Very, very cool. So be sure to be here for that wonderful episode. And on Tuesday, September 27th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, we have a really cool show. Don Durston from NASA's Ames Research Center is going to talk about his work on the X-59 supersonic aircraft, attempting to bring supersonic flight over populated areas through their design that reduces the sonic boom and makes it almost imperceptible. So really, really cool things happening at NASA Ames Research Center. And on Tuesday, October 4th at 8 p.m., Top Gun Maverick stunt pilot and aerial coordinator Kevin LaRosa will be here on Social Flight Live. Until then, I wish you all blue skies.